Happy Thursday, everyone. I'm so glad you were able to join us. I have Amanda Flynn here with Ironwood Business Consulting. She is going to be doing our presentation today. A few housekeeping items. If you haven't already, if you would kindly mute your computer so there's no distractions while she is presenting. I do want to remind everyone, as a client of NCW and Sanford and Tatum, you do have access to Amanda and her team at Ironwood. So should you encounter an HR issue, should you have questions when it comes to our particular topic today that you want to follow up with her on, there is some paperwork involved, but once that paperwork is completed as a client of ours, you do have complimentary access and can reach out to her at any point in time for guidance. So I do encourage clients to go ahead and get that paperwork done and in place, even if you are not struggling with anything at this point in time, because crises do arise quickly, and we like to have that paperwork done ahead of time so we're not all scrambling to get that in place. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to Amanda. We are utilizing the Mentimeter platform that we've utilized in the past. And I'm trying to see, let me see if I can
drop it in the chat, the code.
Can we see your screen, Amanda?
Oh, yes, let me.
There we go. Perfect. So if we can go, if you don't mind, Amanda, to that next slide. I believe the code is at the top of that next one. So we are utilizing Mentimeter, and if you've participated in any of our seminars in the past, you will be familiar with this, but this helps us kind of gauge and figure out, where our clients are with some of these things. So if you would, and if you are interested in participating, you can do it on your computer or your phone, but go to www.menti.com, and our code is there on the screen, and it'll ask you to enter that, and you'll be able to participate along the way. So Amanda, I'm going to pass things off for you because I know you have a lot to cover, and we appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And thank you guys for joining us this morning. As Elizabeth mentioned, we are going to have several interactive pieces, and I'll have that website for Menti and that code up as we go, but it's a good idea to go ahead and log in now, like Elizabeth mentioned, because we only have about 30 or 45 seconds on the actual slide when we're asking it live. So if you could open another tab and contribute there, that would be great. We'd appreciate it. There's the code again. And again, we're here today to discuss how to craft useful and compliant job descriptions. Let me get this last part set up. There we go. So as most of you know, a job description is a useful plain language tool that explains the tasks, duties, functions, and responsibilities of a position. It can detail who performs a specific type of work, how that work might be completed, the frequency, the purpose, and from an employer liability perspective, which is an angle we're going to talk about quite a bit today, it can also serve as a vital piece of documentation. Another thing to consider, just as an overview about why we need job descriptions, is it truly affects the full life cycle of your employees, from the application piece, from your job posting, through the life cycle of establishing titles, establishing a salary range. When you are giving feedback and having performance review sessions throughout the year, you have something to relate back to. If something were to come up, and we'll touch on this a bunch, but some sort of reasonable accommodation, an ADA issue, somebody returning from FMLA, someone returning from workers' comp, there are several reasons why this job description comes up that we don't often think about. And of course, then also career and succession planning. You've captured that top-notch applicant and you've got a star employee, but you want to keep them. So you want to engage them and challenge them and clearly define how they would get to the next level. When you craft your job descriptions, it's a great idea to really consider who your audience is going to be for these. It can be a really easy step for us to overlook, or we can do that job description later. It's not necessary. Let's just get this person up and going. Or maybe you had one and then the job changed or the position changed, the individual changed departments, and you think, oh, I'll do it later. But if you're either updating your job descriptions or you are starting a new set, think about it in this capacity. There are lots of people whose eyes could eventually be on that document. There could be a slew of different government agencies that, should something go awry or should there be just a general investigation of your files and your organization, that could come in and request that documentation. That could be anywhere from the Department of Labor trying to examine whether your exempt versus non-exempt employees are properly classified. That could be even looking at employees versus independent contractors. It could be more EEOC if there was a discrimination issue or concern, making sure that that was valid. So just a slew of different government agencies that could potentially request this document at some point. Additionally, workers' compensation. You may think, okay, we're a smaller company, or we don't have FMLA, we don't normally have a lot of accommodation or disability issues. Almost all of us over the scope of our careers have come in contact with workers' compensation at just some point. When you have employees, even the safest of facilities sometimes experiences injuries. And that job description is going to become vital in that process, whether it be offering a light duty assignment or having the doctor consider what the employee needs to be able to do to return to the office or to their role. It plays a major piece. And workers' compensation inquiries is actually one of the main reasons I wanted to focus on this today. I know at its core, it doesn't sound like the jazziest title to discuss, but after talking to so many more of you guys this year, in addition to just other general client calls, one of the biggest, I want to say not the number one, but maybe the number two most common call is working through either an injury or a workers' comp issue throughout that life cycle. So either they are just going out and you're needing assistance on navigating that process, they've already gone out and you're trying to figure out how to do that light duty offer, or you're trying to navigate if they can come back to work. Having that job description is going to be vital to set up what pieces of the job are essential and what are the physical requirements for the job, what is the environment that the individual would be working in. Each of those are going to play a major role in that workers' compensation process. You also want to think worst case scenario, if something were to come up and you did end up having to go through some sort of litigation. It could be a judge actually officially looking at the paperwork to decide whether or not something was clearly defined or whether or not you as the employer made the right call. It could also then go to the jury. And we mentioned that and separate it from the judge because it's important to remember that although we want the descriptions themselves to be very specific to that role and that function and that essential duty, it doesn't need to be necessarily in technical jargon or really job-specific language that a lay person would understand. So if a random jury member was reading their job description, they should be able to pretty easily understand what is required for this role, which is why we described it as a plain language document. It's also something that applicants are going to see. So whether that be because you took the job description and that was your base for your posting, or now you are down to your interviews and your final candidates or even your offers and you're actually presenting the job description for the applicant, they are going to want to see, you know, what this job really requires, if it's something that they want to move forward with, or even at the initial stages, if it's something they want to apply for. And right now, with the talent market so tough, that's a really important piece to consider. Think about how job boards look and how little time individuals spend at each different posting. It's seconds. You need to be able to clearly show what you are looking for and what would be required of the individual. And then last but not least is going to be your employees themselves. That's going to be the managers that are going to need to refer back to these documents. Again, if they're doing performance reviews, if they are looking at doing raises or considering promotions or re-evaluating your salary bands, whether it be the actual individual themselves to determine what might be a part of their job, it's going to become an active part of, again, the full life cycle of your employment status. Okay, so now we are to our first interactive tool. And so we're going to spend a little bit longer here this first time if you didn't log in, but we're going to go quicker in the future. But again, if you go to menti.com and you enter our code, it's 6998-6885. Our first question, and there's no wrong answer, that's why you're here today if the answer is no, is what % of your employees currently have job descriptions? And I'm going to give us just a little bit of time for everybody to flip over. Thank you guys that are participating. No one's at 0 yet. That's amazing. Okay, if you want to continue voting, you can still log in. Even when I move on to the next screen, it will keep the poll open. And when we finish the presentation, Elizabeth has it later to distribute it, we'll actually have the final total. So you can still come in and vote later if you're not in a position right now to open another screen or you don't have a device handy to do that. But it looks, you know, pretty evenly spaced out between our 25%, our 75%, and our 100%. So that's great. Most of us already have something to start with. And I think a lot of times that's half the battle. When I'm working with clients and helping them either develop the initial job description or do a full overhaul, I always tell them that the first 1 or 2 are really the hardest because you're setting up that format, you're deciding what the look and feel is going to be, and how you're going to distinguish the different roles, the different departments. And then once you really get a format that you're happy with, it's easier then to just start filling out the individual components. And so to go ahead and do that, so whether it be again to update or to start from scratch, we're going to be working through 7 different steps to develop that. And we'll be going into detail in each one of these steps, but we'll be evaluating needs. We're going to look at doing something called a job analysis, establish our essential functions. We're going to organize the data concisely. And then we're going to add a few things, add a disclaimer and signature lines. And then the last but not least step is to finalize it. And again, we're going to go into detail about each one of these. Keeping that in mind, we are going to start out, again, don't expect you to know it all, but we're going to gauge with a case study here at the beginning, and then we'll do a second one towards the end. But I want you to consider this scenario. You have an employee, let's say his name is Eddie Riaz, and he is a sales representative for a beverage distribution company. So within that, he visits multiple accounts a day, he sells, he takes inventory, he collects funds, he makes deposits, he puts up posters, he makes calls and visits, the full life cycle of customer sales representatives traveling. Unfortunately, Eddie has a car accident, and he ends up being eligible for FMLA. So he is out for about 8 weeks. And as the 8 weeks are coming to a close, his employer sends his doctor the paperwork asking if there's going to be any restrictions. Many of you have probably been through this life cycle with FMLA before. And if not, it's pretty similar to the series of events with ADA accommodations or workers' comp, just the paperwork's a little bit different. So asking the doctor what restrictions would be if he came back, when he does come back. And they sent a job description. Again, he's a traveling customer sales representative, and his job description focused on his customer service skills, his industry and product knowledge, and his communication. So when the doctor returned the documentation, he said he could come back to work full time, but that Eddie can't walk, stand, run, or jump for prolonged periods of time. So the employer came back to Eddie and said, unfortunately, that position is no longer available. We can't put you back in that role. We'll find you something else in a few weeks. So my question for you, and again, we haven't dug in yet, so no wrong answers, is do you think that employer's response was compliant with what we know about the requirements for job descriptions and the different federal regulations so far? So take a minute to log in and put your answer. Again, the individual traveling customer service representative for beverage distribution gets in a car accident, goes out on FMLA. They ask the doctor what restrictions he might have and send the job description. The job descriptions for a customer service representative that communicates and interacts with customers. Doctor comes back and says, no walking, standing, running, any of those physical things. And then our test was it compliant to say that there wasn't a job available and they would have to find them something else. So you guys did great. The court did rule that the employer did not act in compliance with federal regulations. Of course, there's about 1,000 more details in the actual legal case. So great job for you guys figuring that out based on what we have. But the idea was that the job description itself in this instance did not list any physical requirements. So that piece where he needed to be standing, sitting, walking around, that huge portion of his job because he was driving from location to location, unloading, none of those physical requirements were on the job description. And in this case, the courts found that was the employer's responsibility to have prepared something adequate to describe his individual role, and that they should have had a position available for him when he came back. So that is just an idea of a common way that the job descriptions would come up with something like FMLA. So your very first step is going to evaluate what you actually need. And we've touched on a few of these points, but thinking about, are you really capturing those top candidates? When you are posting new jobs and going through the interview process, are you really attracting the right people, qualified individuals, or are you losing a lot of time with people that either aren't really a good fit for the job or aren't qualified for the job? And a lot of you guys said you had job descriptions, but has it been 2, 3, 5, maybe the job descriptions have never been updated? You may run into that some of your job descriptions need to be updated, but not others. So it's great to go through and see how old they are. And then even more importantly than age is, do they accurately reflect the role now? Do you have something to base your performance measures? So again, that would be both your performance review type things. It would also be that disciplinary piece when you are counseling an employee, or if it progresses to some sort of written documentation or disciplinary action, that you have the documentation to back up, this is what the job requires, this employee is not doing that. And then if it goes a step further, does that documentation support a termination? That could have, again, been, for repeated disciplinary actions if they weren't performing the job. It could have been when somebody returned from either FMLA, like in our previous example, maybe from workers' comp. That, again, with workers' comp calls, that's probably the number one question, is some sort of inquiry about, can we terminate this individual? Do we have to hold their job? So thinking through how comfortable you are with each of these components and which roles you might need to really focus on. So in thinking about that, if you haven't updated them recently, why do you think that is? And you can actually answer with more than one result. It will let you vote more than once, I believe. And I will tell you, I had a little bit of trouble even coming up with multiple options on this one, because my first thought went to time, because time is always one of our most valuable resources. And again, that's where I wanted to really encourage you, once we have gone through and been able to review all of the 7 steps today, again, that first one or two, just laying out that framework, are the most challenging. And from there, then it gets a lot easier to just plug in the individual differences. Okay, thanks, guys. Another big piece, because time is the number one issue for us, all of us, I feel you, is thinking about step 2, performing a job analysis. So what I want to really share and encourage is that this is not a singular person's responsibility. This is not you as the individual that gets HR as other duties as assigned, or as a head of a department. The manager does not have to do all of the steps of this process. It can be something that you can engage with your actual employees. It's actually a really good idea to talk to them about the types of things that should be on their job description, because they're the one actually performing the job day to day. And if you are several steps removed or on a different site, you need a little bit more information about what is actually happening. You can also then do some observations. You could, create some sort of questionnaire or worksheet. Again, if you're in different locations, or if time is a factor where the interviewing or observation may not be realistic for you, you could do some sort of questionnaire or worksheet to help gather more information. You could also, again, pull in supervisors and managers. This does not have to be a one-person job. That will be really helpful too when you're thinking about that performance management aspect and those essential functions. What does this individual have to be able to do this job? And then collect other data and resources. This is your chance to really dig in and see what else is out there. You can look at similar jobs. There are several different government sites that list some basic job requirements and the most common functions and components. But you're taking each role and you're going to be looking for this information. Further, the next things you'll be looking for on this analysis, which is a big piece of it, this is all your work on the front end, is you're going to determine what sort of knowledge they have to have. So what body of information, either acquired by formal education or by experience, is going to be required. What skills, so what observable competencies. You'll see competencies listed a lot of times on job descriptions. What sort of abilities? So can they perform it and be observed? What sort of physical characteristics? I've mentioned this quite a bit since we've been talking about how it really impacts you as the employer, but those would be, again, lifting, stooping, that must be able to lift up to 50 pounds or repeatedly lift, X amount of weight over the course of the day. Environmental factors is a big one to consider as well. Now, if it's a traditional office job, that might be a little less of an area that you need to do a lot of research on. But some of these more physical jobs, outside jobs, if you're exposed to heat, to chemicals, to elements, it's going to be really important that that is listed on there, as well as any relevant PPE. You don't have to list every specific piece of PPE that would be required. I mean, general safety glasses, things like that don't have to make it on there. But if there are very specific types of equipment that the individual has to be able to use, it would be a good idea to mention that. And just as an example, it came up the other day when I was talking with a client that the individual couldn't wear a respirator for different medical reasons. And we were working through, that was required because of what they were exposed to in this role. And then credentials or experience. So then if there's any specific formal degrees or years that you're looking for, those are all the things that we're going to consider. And again, that can be accomplished in any of those ways that we discussed. That could be interviewing, that could be worksheets, that could be observation, or a combination of all of those things. So I've already used this phrase several times, essential functions. That is going to be the question that you are asked repeatedly, especially from those government agencies. It's also what's going to be on a lot of the medical forms where they are trying to determine if the employee can come back. What is challenging is that so many of the government agencies ask what is essential to this job, but most of the time they leave us in the dark about what that actually means. So over time and different court cases, we've had to determine, how that is generally interpreted, because otherwise, if we just went to straight dictionary definitions, which both essential and function are up on the screen now, that doesn't really tell us what we need to write in the job description. It gives us an idea, but it's really not enough information. The one agency that does provide specific guidance that explains what an essential function is the EEOC, which has been really helpful because they have broken it down, and there is a lot of questions. But to summarize some of the big ones, again, thinking equal opportunity, discrimination suits, why choices were made, asking yourself, does the job description or does the position exist to perform a specific function? Are there other people that can perform the function? A lot of times when you are trying to decide if it's a reasonable accommodation, you look at, okay, if there's 4 people that are doing the same job in the same place, maybe the other 3 could pick up the slack temporarily. But thinking through if there are others, again, how much that skill and expertise, and you're going to know that because you did your data analysis. Here is the big one. The EEOC specifically instructs us to have a written job description prepared before advertising or interviewing for the position. And the train of thought there is that this would eliminate changes after the fact that could exclude either a specific group of individuals or discriminate in some way, and making it unfair, or making your candidate that you did chose qualified now, but perhaps they weren't before. Actual years of experience, again, we've touched on that. And then this last one is interesting. How much time is spent performing a function. And I thought that that was an interesting ad on the website to specifically speak to, because there are a lot of roles where a huge essential function, a main piece of the job, a really important duty, may not actually end up being a majority of the individual's time. And where I'm going with that is, let's use the example of a firefighter. Again, no wrong answers here, and you can write in more than one, but think about, why does that role exist? I mean, don't overthink it. Just very at face value, why does it exist? And what would be the essential functions for that role? I'll give you a few minutes, and if not, I'll help you out. I know this one was open-ended, so it's a little tough. Help those in need, awesome. Car accidents, it's good. People don't always remember that it's things other than fires. So some other things: preventing fires, containing, really that safety component. Oh, there we go, perfect. That safety component, you know, it might be building inspection type things, and all sorts of different functions. They support your local community. They definitely, if you're thinking more essential functions, there's definitely some physical requirements for firefighters that would be non-negotiable. You know, in a lot of roles, again, we talk about an accommodation and someone else could do the job. But if it's an active firefighter, they're going to have to be able to have, you know, a pretty high level of physical endurance and very specific needs to be able to safely do that job. Another example with that that's commonly used, because people often overlook some really basic things, like if the individual needs to be able to see to perform their job. Again, you're in the office, there might be accommodations if something were to happen and someone were to lose some of their vision, or maybe it's, you know, at that legally blind status, where whether it be the aid of other individuals or different accommodation and accessibility options, there may be a way for a lot of jobs to continue going with that specific employee without having to move their roles if someone were to lose their sight. That would probably not be an option for an active firefighter. Now, it doesn't mean they couldn't be with the service and they could go to a different role, but being able to see the fire and the situation that they are running into would be considered essential for that role. And I liked this example because of that last question, because when you think of firefighters, you know, often to fight fires is the number one thing you think of, but that would actually be a pretty small percentage of their day-to-day job. But it is a main component. You do have to consider both of those factors when thinking about what is essential. So it can't just be a list of what the person does all day. Again, it has to be bigger than that. You want your key pieces of information, not this every role and responsibility are minor things, every report that has to be done, every specific goal or deadline. It needs to be a bit more general than that and take it up a higher level to a competency type function. So step 4, now we have all this information. We've taken all of our roles, and with the help of the other employees in our teams and our research online, we have lists of essential functions. Now what do we do with it? Because it seems like the research part for me is the easy part. It's the actually putting it on paper sometimes where I slow down a little bit. And what that looks like, what you're going to present again to that employee, to that applicant, that list before when we said consider your audience, this is going to be really important, because again, think an applicant is just going to scan it very quickly within seconds. And if you have a lot of jumbled information that is not easy to see section to section or to read and understand, maybe it's in that specific jargon to that industry, they're going to keep moving on. There's going to be too much information. There's another job that's going to have a clearer way of organizing their data. So initial things that you'll want to include are pretty straightforward. The actual title for the job, which normally, is all of us as we're picturing job descriptions is probably, the very top item. But you do want to make sure it is specific and relevant to that job, and that the one that the individual is actually doing now. You'll also want to include that classification. And what I mean there is whether this is exempt or a non-exempt position. So whether or not that individual is exempt from overtime. A lot of times, individuals commonly refer to that as salary versus hourly. There is some minor differences there, but whether or not they are exempt from overtime or not, you would list on there. If you have salary levels or ranges, and when I say this, it doesn't have to be a specific number. Sometimes when I think of it more in government type roles where it says salary range Z or salary range number 13, and we might not exactly know what that is, but somewhere it is listed for the applicant or individual to be able to see what that range is. But some sort of idea who that individual would report to. Date, and by date I mean when this job description was either written or revised. So how current it is. And then some sort of summary or objective at the top, which is kind of going to just be your introductory statement. So that first set, is really, think of that as your top of your first page. This is probably going to be in a chart format or just a few lines, your initial information, but again, probably what someone is going to look at first. Then you'll move in, and that first big section is going to be those essential functions. And again, this is not a full list of each role and responsibility that an individual completes. You want it to be specific enough that, again, if you're trying to describe what is most important for an individual to accomplish in this role, that it's there, but not overly detailed to the point where you have every report listed versus the overall aspect of reporting or being able to synthesize and analyze data. Beyond that, then you'll also have competencies, and that could be listed a number of different ways. Sometimes there'll just be a competency section, and it might be things like strategic analyzation, communication, and then a little blurb about what each of those means. Or it could be those knowledge, skills, and abilities that we touched on earlier, but what would be required in that way for the job. If this role has any supervisor responsibilities, you'd want to list that on there as well. And again, back to that work environment and the physical demands. So again, where they would do the job and what they would be required to do. Again, think lifting, stooping, bending, seeing, those sorts of things. It's a good idea to list either the type or expected hours. That may not, again, have to be a set schedule. If you do have any sort of schedule that differs from a standard 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, you might want to list specifically on there, weekends occasionally required, or if it's an early time, but it also could just be part-time versus full-time or the number of hours per week. Consider if there's any travel involved, you might list that as a percentage. For education and experience, oftentimes we recommend breaking that into what's required and what's preferred. Again, we want to be careful with what's required because we might find a really great candidate with 2 less years of experience. And then it seems fine now, we think it's no big deal. And then 5 years from now, when we haven't updated that job description and we reject another candidate that didn't have enough experience, you have this precedence that that required level wasn't really accurate before, and again, could open you up for liabilities or discrimination. So you can also list that required. So maybe it's only 3 years of experience required, but we'd prefer 5+. You may not have both all of the time, but if it is something you would like to list and put in there, you can have both of those components as well. I see that a lot with language as well. You know, it'll put must be able to communicate in English, but we prefer someone that is bilingual in such and such languages. Any sort of eligibility. So again, just that qualification, able to work here, able to work for this employer and in this state. Some sort of statement normally at the end is where I'm envisioning it, that you're an equal opportunity employer, just to publicly state that you're not going to discriminate in any part of this process. And then from there, you'll also want to add a disclaimer. And by that, I mean that phrase that we all know and love, other duties as assigned, or something similar to that. Because again, we're not going to list each and every little thing that the employee does. We just want those big major components listed on the job. So that could be a line at the end of your essential functions. A lot of times I like to list it really at the end of the job description, before the signature and date lines, but after the full description. So that way it's not just speaking to essential responsibilities, but any of your other sections as well. And again, it could be that other duties as assigned, or it could be duties, responsibilities, and activities may change or be assigned with or without notice. You just want that general notice to the employee that there could be some changes to this. Now, obviously, if you were going to make major changes, it would be time to go ahead and update your job description. But you want a general disclaimer there at the end. So, question time. Based on what we have discussed about essential functions and the components of our job test, employees are not required to perform tasks that are not on their job description. And is that true or false? I'll give you guys just a minute.
Amanda,
Okay.
following this question, I have received a question that I think is applicable to this section. So I want to ask it after we do this vote.
Perfect.
Thanks.
And you guys are at 100%. That would be false. We've just touched on that pretty heavily. I said essential functions 28 times so far. You know, we're just listing the big pieces, and we've added that disclaimer that we just touched on, that other duties could be assigned. So good job.
So Amanda, so if a client or if an employer hires an employee with a particular job description, and let's say that employee is there over 3 years, and that job evolves and those job requirements evolve as well and change, when that job does change and a new job description is applicable, is that something that you would rewrite and then sit down with that employee? Is that something they would need to kind of sign off on if that role does evolve and change? How does that look?
In best practices, best case scenario, yes, there would be some sort of update or new role written, because one of the big pieces you want to think about, especially in this example, is that the job description needs to really be written for the role. It is not written for a specific individual. So could the next person that walks into this role, what would be the expectations? One thing you could do if let's say the role has never expanded before. So now this person is in this role and they're becoming a senior version of that. So maybe the previous version exists and then you upgrade that job description and you just add a few components. Maybe it's a few more years of experience or some other specific tasks. Maybe now they're a supervisor. You could add senior roles. Sometimes that's where you'll see the different levels. Administrator 1, Administrator 2, and it's mostly the same job description. And at the end, you can actually even just put, here's what is expected of a 1, 2, and 3, and you list the differences. So yes, ideally, if that role is evolving, you would either update the job description for the new responsibilities, or you would create a new one if it's a whole new role and somebody's going to be doing the old role.
And then as far as that employee, do they need to sign off on that? Or is that something, how do you document that, since it wouldn't necessarily be a new interview process?
Yeah, it's not unusual to have employees sign a job description at multiple times, whether at a company. Again, as their roles grow and expand. And that's exactly how you would explain it to them.
Right.
You know, you have taken on more roles and we have evolved. You would still keep the original in their file, but they're going to sign and date this next one and we're going to add it right to it. So if there was ever any question.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so now we have a lot more information than we did at the beginning. So let's look at our final case study. So in this scenario, we've got an individual employee, Brian Green. He was an operations manager responsible for directing, coordinating all of the warehouse activity. So he's interacting with his associates. He's overseeing all of the transportation and all the movement. He's managing personnel, managing timely deliveries, reviewing reports, all of the physical components of a warehouse manager. Green has to leave for some sort of unjob related, so this wouldn't be a workers' comp, so some sort of personal medical issue comes about, and his doctor only releases him to return to work for 4 hours a day. And in this case, Brian said that his rights had been violated according to the ADA, so that's that reasonable accommodations, because their employer did not hold his job. They maintained that he had to work 50 hours a week. So with that, were the employee's rights violated? So again, to recap, so you've got a warehouse manager. He's doing all of the production, interacting with the employers. Something happens outside of work and he can only work 4 hours a day. He is told that his job is no longer available to him, and then he goes and sues. Do you think his rights were violated? Give you guys a few more minutes, a few more seconds. And it's tough because obviously in these court cases, there's an abundance of information out there, and we're just trying to add a couple of bullet points. So actually in this situation, the courts ruled with the employer. They took the side of the employer that they did not have to hold Brian's job. And the reason that they did that in this scenario was there was a job description that very clearly defined what was expected of a manager or of a supervisor. And both in the description and then actually later in testimony, he and the employer stressed that this job could not be accomplished in less than 50 hours a week. So by the doctor saying he could only work 4 hours a day indefinitely, There was no way that he would be able to continue in that role. The court said that the employer did not have to restore him to that. That wouldn't be reasonable because you'd have to hire a full other individual to do that. So that one was a little tricky, and I think it's threw a double negative in there too. That made that a little more tricky. Okay, so we're almost to the end here, step 6. And you guys are ahead of the game, because how would you know that the employee received it? So we want to validate. We want to show that this description has been approved and it's understood. So then at the bottom, you'll add a signature line. It's a really good idea to add both a line for the employee and for the supervisor. The supervisor is signing, again, just to validate that this information is accurate, that this is truly what's in the description. They're approving it on paper. And then, of course, you also want to date it, because we just mentioned, you know, you could, over the life cycle of your employment, have more than one. And then your final step is to finalize. And that being, send it on to whoever needs to approve that. So if you have tasked this to your individual departments, maybe that's now coming back to you to read through and give final improvement. If you have an HR individual or someone that performs that task, maybe they're reading through it. Maybe it's the executive team that needs to give final approval on the job, but have all of the individuals that need to sign off on it, review it, and maintain, again, that it's valid, it's accurate, the essential functions are clearly laid out. And then last piece of that finalization is start using it. Use it for those job postings. You know, you put all this work into it, and you would maybe not be surprised. You would be surprised then how little individuals might actually refer back to the document. But you've put all this work there. You can easily turn that into a job posting. You can easily convert that into your standardized interview questions to see if an individual is qualified. If those ADA things come up and disabilities have to be accommodated or potentially accommodated, you've got those essential functions right there. That's what you're going to be sharing with the doctor or medical specialist. When you do performance reviews, you're going to have them, again, right there to be able to evaluate if they're performing their job duties. If you are reviewing compensation, so great example that you guys just asked about, if that role has evolved, if you were going to give that individual a raise because they've taken on these new responsibilities, really strong documentation for that would be a second job description with either an explanation of a senior role or a second level, because then again, you're showing that this person was given more money because they took on additional responsibilities and have achieved these things. Again, always coming back to, you need to be able to show why one person was provided extra compensation versus another, so that you can't ever come back and say that everybody was expected to do the same thing, but only one person got a raise. You need to be able to clearly show that this individual does more and is expected to do more. And then just for general reference, whether that be for the employees or your managers, if you have them and have either an intranet or a common site that people can put them on, make them available there. Again, do secure the final version. I think I skipped over that first bullet point, but what I mean by that is, if you are putting it out there into your intranet or sharing that approved version with other individuals, make sure you make that an Adobe document and you keep the Word document there on your computer or in a safe place, so that you could either update it in the future or use it as a base to create something else. But what you send out, you of course want it to be in a format where they can't edit it. So we've gone through all 7 steps. And now we are to any other questions. questions that we have.
So feel free to submit those questions via the chat box. I know some of you have a hard stop at a certain time to get to your next meeting. Please do know I will be sending out the recording of this should you wish to share it internally with some other individuals that might not have been able to participate today, as well as the slides for you to share within your organization. As a friendly reminder, I did mention this at the beginning, but if you joined throughout the presentation, as a client of NCW and Sanford Tatum, you do have access to Amanda and her team of experts. So if questions do arise, here we go, here's her information. If questions do arise and you're reviewing something and you want to circle back around with her on a specific question, please know that you can do that. There is some paperwork involved, and I will send that paperwork in the follow-up email. So if your organization hasn't signed up yet, I highly encourage you to go ahead and get that done. You don't have to go through me each time. If a question arises and that paperwork has been completed, you have access to call them directly or email them directly to help make your job easier. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day. I know everyone's time is very valuable, and I hope you found today's presentation to be beneficial. Let's see. We had a question on a confirmation or a certificate to provide our director. I can see about that and follow up with you if that's something that can be done. Let me make a note of that. Are there any other questions while we have a couple more minutes? Okay, well, please watch for that follow-up email from me either today or tomorrow, and with the link if you wish to rewatch. Amanda, we so appreciate you and your time and expertise, and I hope everyone has a great end to your week.
Thank you.
Thanks.